I can walk like this, right? Does this microphone work? Yes? Yes? Okay. First of all, I'm really honored to be here. And this is going to be an interactive session. So you will have to do a bit of work. And hopefully you will enjoy doing a bit of interactive work. If I speak too fast, let me know. If I speak too slow, also let me know. I'm here for you, and I'm happy to discuss whatever you want to discuss. So, just a little bit about myself. I actually never expected that I would become a professor at the Open University. To be honest, and we had this discussion before, originally I'm a trained economist. I hated researchers who were publishing. I was a passionate teacher. I wanted people to become passionate teachers. And it's amazing what you can do in terms of teaching and learning. And then my head of the department in economics said, but Bart, if you want to stay, you have to publish. And eventually I became pretty good at this game of publishing. But deep in my heart, I'm an educator. And what I'm really interested in is this kind of interdisciplinary notions of learning and teaching. So what I'm most proud of, this is in Web of Science, my publication track record. I not only publish in educational research, I also publish in computer science, I publish in sociology, I publish in psychology. I have weird friends from all across the globe, and I'm hopefully that you will be my next friends, because what I want is basically to learn from as many people as possible, because the world is too complex to think only from an educational perspective or from an economics perspective. And yeah, that's, I guess, who I am. What I'm particularly interested in is technology. So everything I do is always linked with technology. And as I was briefly discussing with Rita, I'm really interested how students and learners use technology to interact. So I've always been fascinated how people interact. And you will do a lot of interaction today as well with technology. Normally, in research, people then say, okay, you choose only one topic and that's your core focus. One topic for me is quite boring. So I decided not to only focus on technology and on social interaction. I was also really interested to really understand learners, the psychology of learners. Why do some learners really actively become users of learning analytics? And why is it that other students are not using this? And what can I understand from that? And at the same time, I'm really passionate about teachers, trying to really understand why do teachers become enthusiastic about technology or not. When I worked in the Netherlands at Maastricht University, of course, we only use hardcore quantitative tools. And I never would imagine, why would you even talk to people? I mean, all the things are in the data, right? But when I moved to the UK and I was the only quantitative person with lots of qualitative people around me, I realized, hey, actually, maybe if we mix some of those methods with qualitative research, you could actually really learn what's happening. And recently I've published papers where there are no numbers. So I guess what I'm trying to build over the next 5 weeks with you in this kind of evidence-based practice is there is not just randomized control trial studies. There are different ways to do research in your field, and there's also different ways to do teaching in your field. So this is the schedule in terms of the evidence-based practice. So today I mostly will provide some examples of conceptual frameworks of evidence-based practice, and I'm pretty sure you know more about it than I. So we will hopefully do lots of interactions with you to get your feeling of what you think evidence-based practice is. Then next week, Friday, I will use lots of practical examples from my own work. I will give a flavor of those practical examples today, but I will mostly give lots of practical examples of how I translate this in my own practice next week. And then the week after, I basically will share practice. Okay, how do you share evidence-based practice from one discipline, let's say sociology, all the way to, let's say, mathematics? Or what we've learned in mathematics, how could we, for example, apply that in, I don't know, health science? Does that sound like a good plan? Yes? Okay. So in order to get the show on the road, what I would like you to do, I guess everyone has a mobile phone, right? Yes. So what I would like you to do is to go to a website which is called polev.com / and then it's my name, Bart Rienties. Sorry, I have a really terrible last name. I do apologize for this. 552. So for the remainder of these sessions, we will use this website where you can basically share your thoughts and feelings and ideas. It's completely anonymous. I won't share this data with anyone. I will be the only one to know who has done what. And so if you go to polev.com / my name, Bart Rienties 552, when you do that, the first question is, what is your name? You don't have to answer your name. You can just ignore that, or you can put your name in if you want to. So the first question, and this is just for fun, is what is your favorite food? So just go log in on your mobile phone or on your laptop if you have a laptop, and just see if you can log in. And let me know if it works or if it doesn't work. So I'm just going to give you a minute. So at least someone has logged in successfully. That's good. So somebody has indicated, I really love sushi, because I indicated Nutella and rice. That's two of my staples that I really love. But let's give you a little bit more time to log into the system, and then you can share this, because later on, this is just a fun question. It's just getting used to your session. Oh, somebody likes candy. Is there anyone brave enough to say, I put that in? No, that's fine. That's fine. Candy, we have potato. Okay, that's cool. So slowly we're getting into the system in terms of what it does and how it works. Oh, it's nice. Somebody indicated fish. I like fish at certain points in time, and sometimes I'm like, oh. Anyway, let's get the show on the road. So what basically will happen is, every time when I ask a question on your phone, you can basically add whatever you want. So the first real question is, what comes to mind when you hear the term or the concept evidence-based practice? So here you can type more than just one word. You can type whatever you want. So if you hear the term evidence-based practice, what comes up to mind? So I'm giving you a little bit of time to type. So looking forward to hear what you think. Okay, so someone posted empirical evidence. Yes, that could definitely be part of the mix. Fish, okay. It's maybe still part of the previous question, or maybe it's an acronym. Okay, it would be a scientific research. Yep. Some people, and we will come back to that probably later, some people might say, well, evidence-based practice is focused on practice. It's not necessarily research, but it's definitely founded on scientific research. Just waiting for more of you to just post whatever you want. There's no right and wrong on this today. Okay. Decisions about patient care. Very good. Just going to wait 20 more seconds just to give you a little bit of time to get used to the system, and also allow you to type a little bit more. So is there anyone here that would like to share? I mean, I appreciate we're being recorded, but if you don't mention your name, no one will know. Is there anyone who would like to share their thoughts in terms of what is already on the board, or perhaps what is not yet on the board? Do you have a good feeling when you hear the term evidence-based practice? Does it resonate positively with you, or does it resonate negatively with you?
Right, well, yes. I assume it would be positive to me because everything that maybe the counselor, teachers, or some educational professionals would have some what he or she does to me would be research based, which is widely generally and commonly found in practically done with the how to say it, with general people. Yeah, and I think if this practice is work on others, and probably I can be more timely to have some intervention with this practice. Yeah, so it sounds more positive and practical to me.
Thank you so much for sharing this. Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to share any positive or negative feelings towards evidence-based practice as a term? No? We can always do that later, and you can always feel free to ask me any questions that you want. So maybe this is a very tricky question. Maybe you just came here because you just thought, okay, I have nothing to do on a Friday night, or maybe you heard my name and thought, oh, I have to go there, or maybe, I don't know. So if you attend those sessions, and I'm also appreciative, some people couldn't join tonight because they're doing marking, but they might come at a later point in time the next weeks. What would you be looking for from these sessions? So I'm just asking you, when would you leave this room and say, yes, I'm really happy that I've attended this session? So what are you looking for in terms of why you're here? In other words, what can I do to make your life successful? You can write fish if you want. Okay, some inspiration about the research. Okay. So I think in particular the second session will be more interesting because there I will go much deeper in terms of what we actually do, because I was asked today to provide a kind of foundation, a kind of conceptual baseline. But maybe if you have a little bit more time, I can definitely show you some bits and pieces on that. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a couple of more minutes to type in. So while you're typing, I'm trying to implement evidence-based research. I don't know if you've noticed this, but you are my patients. You are my customers. You are my learners, right? And I don't know what you want. So by asking you what you want, maybe I can become a more effective teacher. Also, lots of evidence across the globe has shown that lecturing for 2 hours like this is not very effective in many instances. But asking people questions and asking people opportunities to interact could actually be beneficial. So I'm using evidence how I design my presentations. So while I give you a little bit more time, somebody wrote, learn some practical intervention and application to use in education. Great. You're definitely at the right spot. So that's what I will do a little bit this week, but definitely will do a lot next week. Get some basic idea of EPB. Yes, that's what I will definitely do. Somebody wrote an interesting introduction. I'm not sure if I can guarantee that, but at least I'm going to give an introduction to EPP. Okay. Somebody wrote to differentiate what EDP is and what it's not, because I agree with you, it could be a container term. I will have a slide of a white man from the 1833, and you can guess who he is. He's been claimed, he's doing some kind of evidence-based research, but probably he didn't even know that he was doing that. So, okay. So, let's get this show on the road then. So, coming to that quote of that white man in 1833, knowing is not enough. We must apply. Or when he probably said it in German, Wissen ist nicht genug, wir müssen es einführen. He said, willing is not enough, we must do. Is there anyone familiar with German philosophy that immediately recognizes this man? No, I had to Google him as well, I wouldn't recognize him. So Goethe said this in 1833, and I think it's a really nice starting quote of evidence-based practice. I spend a lot of my time in labs with my students doing hardcore experiments, finding amazing learning analytics data, and then I publish a paper on it, and then I hope that someone will read it. So I know something about how the human brain works. But just knowing something about the human brain is not sufficient. We then have to apply it into practice. And then when you get to practice, often you have really good practitioners who potentially are interested in that idea that I did in the lab. And then they think, oh yeah, Bart, that is a really great idea. Thank you for sharing. So they understand the idea, they want to apply it, but willing is not enough. It's about actually then implementing that research into practice and then learning whether or not that works. So in a way, Goethe already had the principles of evidence-based research well before our time. But originally it has developed in the early 90s in medicine. And in medicine, I don't know how the medical situation is in Hong Kong, but in the early 80s and early 90s, my parents are from a medical field, and most of it was just kind of common sense. And we've always done this in a particular way, but it was not very evidence-informed. Yes, you had researchers like us, and then you had the practitioners. And he said, okay, maybe we should really use the experience of both the clinicians and the researchers to bring together what is the best research and how can we implement it in daily practice. And eventually this led to the famous Sicily statement, which I'm just going to read this out. Healthcare delivered in ignorance of available research evidence misses important opportunities to benefit patients and may cause significant harm. This in a certain way is linked with what you're saying. So as a practical example, I'm a medical patient myself, and for years the standard practice was to transcribe prednisone to transplant patients. And people would get really big faces, and it was very bad medication. But for years it was just a common practice until a couple of doctors tried a different medication and then found, well, maybe it's actually not so good to give patients this kind of medication. It might even give significant harm. And providing evidence-based care is recognized as a key skill for health workers from diverse professions and cultures. If you hear the word health, or if you hear the word patient, replace health with teacher and replace patient with student. How many of you on a weekly basis, when you're teaching, read articles about your teaching? Or in other words, how many of you are actually using evidence to inform your teaching? Not many of us, I guess. But what evidence-based research or practice says is it should be a key skill for all of us to read 1 or 2 articles a week on the job we're doing and seeing, is there anything new out there that could potentially help to improve our practice? And what basically the Sicily statement says, so the ability to deliver evidence-based practice promotes individualization of care. So everyone is different, so everyone might need a slightly different treatment. But if you don't know what good evidence is for one particular patient, it's very difficult to then also give it to a different patient. And assures that the quality of healthcare for patients today as well as those of tomorrow, which I think is also a point that you've made. All the treatments that I'm currently getting from my transplant that I got from my mother not only helps me, but it helps millions of other transplant patients across the globe, because we're continuously tracking data about me, and that data is then used for lots of other people. And then they can see what works well for me, might also benefit a future person with, for example, kidney transplant. So it is this kind of holistic approach. And this holistic approach is not just focused on the best research evidence that is available. It's also not just focused on the clinical expertise of the doctor or the expertise of the researcher or the expertise of the teacher. An equal weight is given to the customer, the patient, in this case. So you could have the best evidence in the world, you could have the best researchers, but if customers or students or patients don't use it, it's basically a waste of time. And this evidence-based practice, and it's quite interesting if we go back to your statements, a lot of these statements are focused on research and focused on getting practical interventions, but in a way, at the core of evidence-based practice is the end user, the customer, the student, the patient, and that's really exciting. So I quite like this picture. We've always done it that way. Have you ever heard that when you were walking down the street and somebody said that to you? Well, we've always done it that way, right? It must be the right way. And this is, I think, the key premise of evidence-based practice. If we always do it in one way, maybe we should change it. Because what is the best evidence that sitting in a room like this is the best way to learn? What is the best evidence that, for example, having a seminar on Friday night is the best way to learn? Well, we will never know unless we test whether maybe having a session on Tuesday brings more people in or brings less people in. We just don't know, but we need to test that. So there are a range of definitions starting from the original one of evidence-based practice, which is an ability to assess the validity and importance of evidence before applying it to day-to-day clinical problems, to, I think, a more rounded definition by Sackett, who in a way says that we need a conscientious, explicit, and I like this word, judicious use of current best practice and making decisions about care or about individual students. The practice of evidence-based research means integrating individual clinical expertise with the best available evidence from systematic research. So, in a way, what this definition is saying is no matter what we do, we continuously have to look back at ourselves. Is there better evidence to do it slightly different? And if we can do something slightly different, let's write articles on this so that we can share this with the rest of the world so that they can learn this from us. So there are 5 steps which I will go through, and then I will put you to work. So prepare for this mentally. You will have to do some work. So the 5 steps of evidence-based practice always start with a problem. But that problem has to be clearly defined. So in a way, a translation of uncertainty to an answerable question. So I'll give you a practical example. How can we solve global climate change? That's a very big problem, but it's an unanswerable question because the problem is too complex. Will the UK ever leave the European Union? God knows, right? I've literally no idea. Will global climate change affect Hong Kong in 20 years' time? Could be a question that you could potentially start to explore. But it has to be a question that is to a certain degree answerable. Is there a God? It's quite difficult to answer that question. Then, and this is, I think, slightly different from other practices, and this is where I think most of the critique on evidence-based practice lies, is, okay, you have a particular problem, and then you think, okay, how can I solve that problem? And that solving of the problem first starts with what actual literature is there out there about this problem. So I spoke to Rita just before. One of my PhD students does research on health and safety in oil companies. So lots of accidents happen on oil companies, and we want to get a better understanding of how to prevent those. And there are 4 or 5 very big systematic literature reviews already out there. So if you have a question how to improve learning from incidents in an oil company, the first step to do is, okay, what do we already know from the literature? What evidence is there already out there that we know works? And then we can start to think about, okay, what do we not yet know? Then, and this is the third step, and this is a difficult step, is the critical appraisal of evidence for validity, relevance, and applicability. I think this is one of the hardest steps that clinicians have to make on a daily basis and teachers have to make on a daily basis. Even if you, for example, find that lecturing is not a very effective form of learning, okay, what other alternatives are there? There are thousands of articles which claim that lecturing is very bad. But how robust is that evidence? There is some evidence that if you do lecturing really well, with a charismatic teacher who does lots of interaction, it could be as good or even better than small group teaching. So how do we make, of all those thousands of articles on do lectures, for example, work, which one do we actually take to inform our practice? How do we believe that the articles that may not have been published in Hong Kong, why would they be relevant for a Hong Kong setting? Maybe in Hong Kong people do like lectures, for example. Then, of course, so you start with the problem, you do your research, what is already out there, and then you assess, okay, which of the research provides the best evidence? And then the question is, once you know the best evidence, you have to apply that to see when you're doing that intervention, does it actually work? Does it work by changing my medication? Do I become a happier person? And when I got a change in medication 4 or 5 years ago, I was very skeptical. But then we did a longitudinal trial, and I read lots of medical evidence, and I thought, okay, let's give it a try. And even if it doesn't work for me, I might help other people along the way to get a better life expectancy. And then you evaluate whether the intervention you've made works. And if it works, fantastic. And then you start again. If it doesn't work, again, you start again. So in a nice visualization, you basically start with, okay, what is the problem that you're starting to identify? So it starts with, okay, what question do you want to ask? And then you need to convert that question that you have in your mind into an answerable, clinical can just be replaced by teaching or whatever you want, an answerable question. Then you acquire more knowledge and information about what is already known out there in the field, what is the best evidence, and you track down the best evidence for answering that question. Then you go to appraise, which is, okay, of the 100 articles on lecture-based teaching, which of those actually are really robust? Which are actually relevant for an Asian setting? Which ones are actually done in such a way that they are still relevant today? So you critically appraise the evidence for the validity and impact and applicability. Then you apply, and finally you then audit whether or not that initial problem that you had in your mind works. And for a clinician, for my doctor, he has to do this within 10 minutes. He has 10 minutes to make a decision whether or not to give me a change in my medication. But how does he do that? How does my doctor decide whether or not to change my medication? Any thoughts? Yes, I am just one data point in a large data point of transplant patients. And he knows me, he has seen me for several years, but he can see from all my data how well I'm doing or how well I'm not doing. And I'm hoping, and that's what good clinicians do, that good clinicians apparently read 3 scientific articles every week. So hopefully when he decides to give me different medication, hopefully I'm not the first guinea pig in the world to do this. Hopefully he has read about this particular thing and then says, yes, I've read the literature, I've tracked down the best evidence, and a change in medication could be the best way forward. But every person is different, so it might be when he applies it to my situation, it doesn't work. So a good clinician would say, okay, I'm trying to experiment, but come back in 2 weeks and see whether it works. Same with a teacher. When I implement this at the Open University, this cycle is a year. We design a course, we manipulate the course, we then implement the course, we evaluate the course. It takes us a year to do that. So it is quite interesting, this way of thinking can be from one simple decision, how do you search in Google, to a 5-year big plan on how to make organizational change. But the underlying principles are the same. So as I said before, you will have to do some thinking. So I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes to, first of all, complete a short survey about you. So these are 7 questions about you, and I want to get a better understanding of how you currently use evidence-based practice. So you can see that people are now starting to open the poll, and it's a kind of a race. Let's see who finishes the race first. I'm kidding, there's no right and wrong. But there are 7 questions, and I'm just gonna embarrass some people by them to complete it as well. Here you go. It's fully anonymous. Do you want to participate? Sorry, Susan, I only have one mobile phone.
No, it's okay.
So this will take a couple of minutes, but it's just basically 7 questions about your practice. And I can see that 3 participants have already filled in 2 questions, which is good. Hooray, somebody's finished. Well done. I don't know who that is. Well done to you. So I'm just going to wait for the last two. But what will happen, and you probably can guess this, for those who have already finished, I will ask, the next question will be is, what is, okay, this sounds weird, but what is your problem? So what is the challenge that you're currently thinking of that you perhaps want to implement in terms of evidence-based practice? So later on that question will come. So just to make sure that everyone's finished, think about already that question. So let's have a look at whatever you said. Okay, this is fascinating. So on the first question, I use evidence to revise courses. Maybe I should have asked who is actually, just by raise of hands, who is actually teaching courses? 1, 2. So you're all students. Okay, so you, okay, yeah, that's fine, that's fine. That's fantastic. But even if you're following courses, you could use evidence to think about, okay, which courses do you use, which courses do you want, etc. So that's great. So what is interesting, and I will later on compare you with some other data that we've collected, but most of you say, well, I sometimes use evidence to revise my courses. On the next question, I use evidence to design a curriculum. Well, if you're a student, then of course you're not necessarily designing the curriculum. But some of you have said yes. And this sounds amazing, 10%, that's probably just one person. One person has said, I always use evidence to design my courses. I use evidence to develop my course unit. Okay, that's good because there are definitely more people in the room that have said this. So I'm just flicking through because I'm mindful that if you're a student, this data does make a lot of sense. But I think this in a way is quite an interesting question. I use evidence to evaluate the effectiveness of my teaching. Some of you are saying, well, sometimes I use this. And 30% of you are indicating, well, yes, I'm often using it, but not always. So it's then interesting, if you're teaching, why is it that you're not reflecting on your evidence always? I use evidence to evaluate the quality of my student learning. Again, what is interesting is that no one uses always. I would hope that your teachers who are not here today will continuously use your voices, your feedback, so that they can use better evidence to inform your class, but also that they will read up on good literature to see how to improve your classes. So this is great. So what I've then done is there is this study in the US where they did exactly the same questions, but then with 500 teachers in nursing practice. So we can compare your answers to their answers. And what is quite interesting, and it's a scale from 1 to 5, is that on most of the questions, and this was done in 2016, most of the teachers who surveyed there, seem to use this evidence-based approach in their practice. And this is probably due to the fact that the US government has forced them to teach in an evidence-based practice. And of course, this is self-report, so of course I will say, yes, I always use it. But it is quite interesting that in certain contexts, this evidence-based practice of teaching is very common. So, yeah, it's interesting to see this. So, as promised, I've asked you to think about a problem. And this problem could literally be, how do I come home tonight? Or what am I eating this weekend? So what is the challenge or problem that you have that you would like to explore in a evidence-based practice manner? So just think about what you want to share. And there is no right and wrong on this. Oh, I have to, yeah, sorry.
Okay, okay, but I don't know what do you mean the evidence.
Yeah. No, but so what? I mean, everyone has problems. What is the problem that you are interested in?
Students to use means. Yes, it is. Of course. Here's good clinician.
Okay. So we already have one volunteer who wrote down the concern of receiving a rejection from my boss. Yeah, that's a big problem. And how would you indeed investigate that challenge? So how would you know when you're in a way not doing such a good job? Or you think that you're not doing a good job? Okay, so that's one particularly good problem to have. So I'm giving you a little bit more time to think of maybe of another problem that you want to address. Oh, work on a thesis, that is a big problem. So my practical problem for tomorrow is I'm going to walk with my wife and Susan in the south of Hong Kong. and I don't know which trail to walk. So my problem is, what is the best trail to walk in South Hong Kong? That's my problem for the weekend. And maybe amongst you there are some good trail walkers that can give me advice, or otherwise I will just Google it or use Strava if it's better. But it's just an anecdote. Okay. So another problem is how to, I'm not entirely sure. Is anyone, I don't fully understand this. Does anyone want to share why he or she posted this question? There's no right and wrong. If not, come back and talk to me afterward. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit more time to think about this, because eventually that will help you through the rest of the evidence-based practice. So Susan, what is your problem?
Well, I have a lot of problems, but I would just say one thing that came to mind. I got inspired by this first one that says require continuing research on evidence. I filled in the blanks and wonder if whoever wrote it, they meant the requirement of having to continually research for evidence. And I was thinking about the difference between evidence and anecdotes, because sometimes I think anecdotes are given a bad rap. Like you come up with something and then someone will say, oh, that's anecdotal, to put it down. And then it has me wondering, okay, it's anecdotal, but what then makes it, when does it become evidence?
Yeah, very good question. So the problem is, when is evidence evidence?
Right.
And that's, it's just one voice indeed. If we're sharing concerns, we're just two laymen, right? And we were discussing this before with the gentleman over there. But some layman or laywoman have particular expertise that is perhaps relevant, right? If, well, maybe Donald Trump is not the right example, but if Bill Gates says something about the future of development in Africa, people tend to listen to him because he has an important voice. Or when, say, the wife of Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, says, I want to run for presidency because of these 4 factors, that has probably more clout than if I say this. So in terms of the anecdote versus the evidence, not all evidence is the same. So it is tricky, and it's interesting. So I don't know the formal procedures. Do we normally have a break, or do we normally continue? No. This is not how evidence works. You're my customers. Do you want to have a break, or shall we continue? Okay.
So we can have early.
Okay. Yeah. Then we can all go down to Hong Kong city center to grab a beer. So, in the old days, how to get more people from the protest of government extradition law amendment? This is probably a very interesting question, which I can't answer, so I'm quickly moving forward. But I'm happy to talk about that later on. So, Kitson made a very nice observation about how evidence was used in the old days in medical practice and where she wants to move next. And I have to talk you a little bit through this, but I think there's a nice link with our current practice. So in the old days, we had lots of research information of doctors sitting in labs, and then we had these workshops where we disseminated those knowledge, and then you had the hospital. And the hospital was a practical environment with lots of political systems, and we had external pressures, and we had external factors, and then, oh yeah, we have the patient. And the patient was a kind of end receiver of all that wisdom and knowledge and organizational culture. And that's a kind of linear implementation model. So if we want to improve the patient's well-being, we have to go through all that complex organizational structure. What Kitson realized was that is increasingly in the 90s there is this two-way system. So yes, researchers do research. Those are informed in terms of systematic literature reviews. That leads to guidelines that are evidence-based. That leads to medical programs that are continuously updated based on those medical program guidelines. And then it is adopted in practice. But at least the cycle goes both ways, while previously it was just top down, right? And what she is basically saying, this is still a kind of system where, again, the patient is not, the core customer is still not really in the loop. And she came up with a formula, which I quite like. So her formula of a successful implementation of change is an equal weighted function of where is the evidence that that change could be positive or negative? Where is the evidence that in the particular context in which you're trying to implement that innovation or implementation is positive or negative? And how is that change facilitated internally or externally? This sounds very simple and vague, but she has a really nice model behind it, and we're going to discuss that model. So that model ranges from low to high in terms of evidence. So we were briefly discussing this. Thank you for bringing this up, Susan. You have anecdotal evidence that a particular treatment might work. Oh yeah, my mom really likes green tea and she says it's very healthy. Or my mom recommends me to use ginger when I'm ill, right? And there could be amazing randomized control trials that indeed show that having green tea is very good for your stomach, or ginger is very good for your stomach. But evidence based on research is just one part of the equation. You also need to have the experts who are teaching, or in this case, clinical experience, if they strongly believe about the quality of the evidence is always true, then it's going to be likely that experts will support the evidence. If there are large different camps, it's not going to happen. So I'll give a practical example within the Open University where I work. When I implemented learning analytics 5 years ago, there were tremendous camps of people who didn't believe in technology, people who said we shouldn't replace technology with robots, and others were really positive about this. But if you want to implement an innovation where there's not a high level of consensus within an organization, it's actually quite difficult to change that organization. And in this case, I mean, patients, we could replace that with students. We could either completely not involve them, as in the first model, or we could build partnerships with those patients. And if the patients believe in the evidence, they will hopefully use it. There is a classical documentary made a year ago on the BBC where they gave 100 patients with back pains a magical pill. Have you seen that documentary by chance? So half the patients got a blue pill, and the other half of the patients got the blue pill and additional one-to-one training. And then there was a third group of 50 people who got a red pill. And they followed them for first 7 days, and then afterwards 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months. And after 2 months, they brought all these patients back. Oh, sorry, my alarm is going off. I need my medication, but I can leave that for a moment. And guess what? 50% of the patients said, I have less problems with my back. Sorry? All the patients indicated that they had less problems with their back. And then the real amazing thing happened. They revealed what was in the pill. And you know what was in the pill? Well, close. It was just rice. So they just gave a rice pill, which of course doesn't do anything. And then they've continued to follow those patients for another half year. And of the 40 to 50% of people who said, I have less back pain, after half a year, what was it? 40% has less back pain. Still 35% who believed in the pill continued to believe that they had less back pain. So the metaphor in a way is, okay, if you build partnerships with your patients, you could actually make a treatment very effective, even if the pill is just a placebo. If people believe that it will help you, it probably will. So what I would like you to do, and this is an experiment, is when you go to your phone, what I would like you to do now is to pinpoint which of all these 3 levels, which of those levels do you think is most important in terms of implementing an innovation in where you work or where you study? So is it, I don't know, developing partnerships with students, or is it let's go for randomized control trials, or let's all do systematic literature reviews? So there's no right and wrong, and I think you can vote multiple times. So if you think it's mostly about patient preference or it's about student preference, it's fantastic. So what is quite interesting, and I didn't expect this when I uploaded this slide, is there's a nice mixture between the 3 elements in the equation. So some of you think, yes, we need very high evidence in order for an intervention to be successful. Some of you think, well, you actually need really good people who are experts in their field to but to basically put their weight behind the innovation. But also quite interestingly, there are lots of you who think, oh, actually, we really need to involve the customer in the evidence building. Okay, so, yeah, go.
Okay. My question at the moment is, where it says clinical experience, low expert opinion divided, several camps, and then high levels of consensus, consistency of view. Maybe it's okay to have several camps, even when there's a lot of evidence. I'm wondering, and maybe that's not appropriate when it comes to drugs. If you're doing pharmaceutical testing, you don't want too many camps about the effect of the drug. But when it comes to research on students and learning, right? Maybe that could be the case. Does that make sense? Is there anyone other thoughts?
So is it okay in education to have multiple camps of thought? What is really interesting, I've worked in 3 completely different universities, and on the one hand, I would agree with you, having multiple thought leaders and different points of view is great. But at the same time, when I worked at Maastricht University, who uses problem-based learning, everyone has to use problem-based learning, whether you believe in it or not. At least all the students got a similar kind of experience, and people knew that when they would come to Maastricht, they would be taught in a problem-based manner, and this was continuously evidenced to be the best manner. While at the Open University, where I currently work, there are literally hundreds of ways to design an online course. And it's great to have the discussions, but I see lots of courses being designed where I know this is not evidence-based, but just because people for example, have a belief that, I'm just making this up while I come along, is, oh, using communication activities in mathematics doesn't work, or using communications and engineering activities so asking students to post something in a discussion forum doesn't work. Well, we can see in other studies that it has an amazing impact. So it is difficult. And I think there's no right or wrong in this. I think you can also probably compensate. If the evidence is really strong of a particular innovation, even if you have different camps, it could actually be quite useful to have those different camps. So it's no like, everything has to be high. But I think it is an interesting start. So the next part in the magical equation is context. So even if the evidence from, for example, hundreds of studies at Maastricht University show that problem-based learning is the best way to learn mathematics and the best way to learn economics and the best way to learn medicine, well, contexts are different, right? So what Kitson basically argues is it's partly related to the culture in which an organization is working. Is it a learning culture, or are you immediately punished if you make a mistake? Is it patient-centered or student-centered? Does it value people, or are people just a commodity? And is there an opportunity for continuous education? If you come up with something new, but there's no education to train people, well, then it's inevitably going to fail. Then in terms of leadership of the organization, are there clear roles assigned of who is implementing the change? Who is helping to facilitate that leadership? And then finally, in terms of, this is a slightly vague way, I think we as economists like this, measurement. How do we measure the kind of incentives to implement these changes? So are there internal measures that measure whether or not you're implementing that approach? Are there external measures to measure that? So for example, at the Open University, every year we have to our students fill in a national student survey, and if we do bad on the external measures, we get punished. So we want to have the best experience for our students. So again, you have this opportunity to vote. So of those elements that we're pushing forward here, which of those elements do you think in your organization where you're studying or working, which ones could be the most important context factor that determines whether or not any intervention that we're making based on the best evidence could work or could not work? So some of you are thinking, okay, it has to be related to the culture, and feel free to also specifically select individual elements if you think that those individual elements are really important. Yeah, so thus far it's quite interesting. Of course, this is far from a representative sample because this is just 10 or 12 people voting. But what is quite interesting is that at least a quite fair number of you are indicating that innovations have to come with leadership. So if there is a good leadership in place, then any intervention, any evidence-based practice that you want to implement could actually help you to implement this. And while I'm talking, of course, there are now more elements of measurement and culture. But it's interesting. So what, in a way, this model shows is no matter how good your evidence-based practice, it's not just you as an individual. It's the environment in which you work that facilitates this. And the last element in the equation is what we call facilitation. And facilitation can mean a lot of different things to different people. So sometimes when an organization is primarily stuck in this field, where there is a very unclear leadership, or where it's very unclear what the in terms of low morale, typically consultants would be flown in, or experts in a particular discipline. And though they could facilitate that kind of change with you, but the facilitator can also be someone within. It could be a champion in your organization that champions the particular intervention. So 4 years ago, I became a champion of a program called Analytics for Action, and I literally knocked on many teachers' doors. Hey, nice to meet you. I want to talk about Analytics for Action. And by having a face to a program, people could actually see, hey, yes, I want to know more about it. Let's go and talk to Bart. And what this facilitator does is basically bring people on board in terms of that new potential innovation. So research, again, in the medical field shows that the number one reason why medical hospitals adopted a new treatment was whether or not the head of the unit was positive about the treatment. If the head of the unit was positive about the treatment, all the others followed. And they particularly found that when the head of the unit, like David, is very charismatic, they're more likely to implement it. So it is fascinating that, okay, how does this facilitator develop this kind of respect and empathy? Is he or she admired in the organization? Does he or she have the authority? Does he or she have the opportunity to change the agenda, etc., etc.? So you need that kind of facilitator to bring across change. So again, if you would think about your own organization, think about, okay, maybe you could be a facilitator for change. What could be an important characteristic for you to implement evidence-based practice? Because evidence-based practice doesn't start from one individual. You can't just say, I'm going to implement evidence-based practice and then everyone else is just going to follow. You need a team in place. You need someone like David, Professor David, who is then implementing and leading this change. So what do you think is an important factor? So some of you are stating it's linked to the style of how that person works. Many of you are saying, okay, it is linked to the characteristics of the respective facilitator, the respect he or she gets, the empathy, does he or she understand the organization? What is the role of the organization? Okay. So again, what is really interesting, if we would optimize all your choices in the equation, which is interesting, you see that all of you are indicating slightly different elements. So when we go back to the really simple formula at the beginning, oh, here it is. A successful implementation of evidence-based practice is built on evidence, contact, and facilitation. Once you unpack that, it becomes a quite difficult narrative and equation, which is interesting. And I think what is also really interesting, just by the visuals, is that it's not just one element that is important, it's the combination of all those elements that are important. So is there anyone who wants to comment on this? Because if not, we can. So I'm just going to summarize briefly what we have found from the literature, and then I will show you one or two examples of my own practice, because one of you indicated I want to learn more how it works in practice. So I think a really important finding was that evidence-based research is not only about randomized control trials. It's also about finding what's the best evidence. If there are no meta-analysis done, anecdotal evidence could be good. But anecdotal evidence then has to be weighted in such a way that you know that it's only anecdotal evidence. Also, I think what is really interesting is that people were very concerned about evidence-based practice leading to a kind of cookbook. This is the best way to teach in Hong Kong. And that's definitely not the case. You need the best people using the best external evidence, making sense of their own context. What would work at the Open University will not work here, and vice versa. So you need those experts. Good doctors or good teachers use both their individual experience and expertise and the best available evidence, but neither alone is enough. So if you have a doctor who has never Googled your medical condition, you should go to a different doctor. At the same time, if you meet a doctor who only Googles your condition and has never actually seen patients, probably go to a different doctor. You need the strength of both. And I think this is also really interesting because this framework is very intuitive when you have the 5 steps. But if you follow it very literally, it seems very simplistic. And I think what the Kitson model quite nicely shows is it's actually very complex. So it's not the holy grail of everything. What is really interesting when you look at longitudinal research is what Kitson found is these evidence-based practices work best when you have very high evidence and you have very high context, so lots of support in your context, and you have good facilitation. They came up with some really interesting studies where they had lots of evidence that a particular approach worked, but if the context was not ready or if the facilitation was not ready, the innovation didn't work. So I think with evidence-based practice, a lot of emphasis is posed on the first word, evidence. But you also need to think about, okay, if you implement this change, where is the context in which you are working? Are they ready for it? And are they also ready in terms of the facilitation? So I'm just whizzing through this. A recent meta-analysis showed that, and this was done amongst 500 professionals, that only a part of those professionals really liked evidence-based practice. And in particular, again, in the US, this was a very common practice, while less than 1 in 3 in France or Germany had heard about the term. So it's also interesting that this is not a panacea for everything. So I guess translating this back to your own context, if we move away from the medical term, what we want is we want to simultaneously get the best research evidence that we have on your problem. We want to get the best understanding of you. Do you understand your customers? And we want to have the best expertise of the team to make an informed judgment about how to change. And I think, to be fair, mostly, if I'm honest, I mostly use this. Yes, I do listen to my teachers and I do listen to my students, but I'm heavily biased towards this. And this is my weakness. And I am aware that I have to listen more to the actual customers and I have to listen more to the experienced teachers. At the same time, many of my experienced teachers that work at the Open University, they have a really good understanding of their students. They have a really good understanding of their own experience, but they typically will not look at what's the best research evidence available. So there's an interesting tension. I think, given the time, this might be a nice final exercise to work with, and then we can call it a day, and then next week I will focus on the practical examples. So, after this framework was developed from 1992 onwards, people would then think, okay, how do we then teach this to students? How do we teach this to staff? How do we make sure that our staff is evidence-based? And in the second Sicily statement, there was this amazing framework, which I will briefly explain, and then you can start to think about where do you think you are currently on this framework. So it starts with a reaction to emotional experience. So you've been sitting here on your seat for 1 hour and 20 minutes, right? You have a heartbeat because you're still breathing. You have an educational experience. I see some of you smiling and some of you on your phone. But what are you doing? Are you asking yourself questions about evidence-based practice? Are you going to search about evidence-based practice? Are you going to appraise your question that you have? And are you going to see, okay, I've looked at this question, what is the literature out there? Am I going to integrate whatever I found into my practice, or am I going to critically evaluate? So the first level is just the reaction to the education experience. It could literally be, do you like the lecture, or did you hate the lecture, right? That's the first level of measuring educational effectiveness of the EPD. Then the second thing, hopefully, is attitude. So when you've completed hopefully these 3 training programs, you not only enjoyed the experience, you hopefully also think, well, maybe I have to think about this evidence-based practice. And maybe you develop a positive attitude to it, or maybe you develop a negative attitude to it. Both are fine. And the third level is, okay, I now know what evidence-based practice is. I may have a positive attitude towards this, but do I feel confident that I could implement it in my own practice? So that's called self-efficacy. So we're slowly building up a ladder. Then, of course, you have to have the knowledge to implement evidence-based practice. You have to have the skills to, for example, run randomized control trials. You have to know when are your students actually using EPM skills in their practice. And finally, this benefit to patients could be replaced by benefits to students or benefits to customers. How do you know that when you're training all these members of staff and all these students, how do you eventually know that your core customers are benefiting from this new approach? It links very nicely to the 4 phases model of Kirkpatrick, for those who are familiar to the training model. So what I would like you to do is to think about your education. Don't think necessarily about what you're doing now as a teacher, but think about when you were studying at a university, right? Where do you think you spent most of your time? Were you mostly focused on the first level? Let's first do the levels, and then afterwards we can focus on this. So where do you think, when you were studying yourself, where do you think most of your efforts by your teachers were put into? Is my question clear? If the poll EV is working. Is it working? Or are you still thinking about the model? Before we go to the second part of the step, let's first focus on these 7 elements. So just place your marker on one of these 7, not here yet, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, so thus far, seems to be that most of your educational experience is focused on knowledge, and most of your experience is focused on the kind of attitude and educational experience. I'm just going to give you a little bit more time to feel more on this. Okay, and many of you have already started to fill in this table, which is quite interesting. So, I mean, feel now free also to do that. So, if you, for example, have identified knowledge as your core focus when you are studying, was it mostly about just asking questions? Was it just, or were you actually requested to search for those particular answers? Did you have to critically appraise those questions? Or did you have to integrate different perspectives, different theories, different approaches? Or did you have to actually critically evaluate this? So in classical economic theory, when we have the Pareto optimization, for example, well, there are probably lots of other problems that we could have discussed, but typically in first year economics, we focus on Pareto optimization. But maybe you spend your time in the library reading about other approaches rather than Pareto optimization. Okay, so what is quite interesting is that many of you focus a lot on behavior and skills, and only one of you has indicated behavior, which is interesting. And yeah, this is interesting because my guess would be, and also if I look at my own life as a student, I didn't know about evidence-based learning when I was a student. And I probably spent most of my time developing knowledge and skills. But because of problem-based learning, we also had to do these 6 steps because there were no answers. We as students had to go out to the library or search the internet ourselves because there was no recipe to solve the problem. We didn't have to read the textbook. So I probably would be somewhere here as well together with you. So that's very nice. So what are then the difficulties? And then I will end up with the difficulties and call it a day. So this all sounds really interesting, right? This is amazing. There are some amazing conceptual frameworks. We all believe perhaps that this is a way forward. But what are the big problems? Well, of course, there are many. And this is again based on a systematic literature review by Mota and De Silva. First of all, the lack of time. I mean, if a doctor has 10 minutes to deal with a patient, do you really want him to Google your medical condition? Do you really want your doctor to read all the articles on your condition? Well, I would hope that my doctor would spend time reading the latest research. But there is a quite nice quote in this particular article that in medical science, all the knowledge is doubled every 10 years. So there are nearly 1 million articles published in 10 years' time. And the next 10 years, there are 2 million articles. So how do you keep track of all the research that's out there? Another thing which became quite clear from the literature review was that sometimes current policies don't embrace this kind of evidence-based practice. It has always worked in the past. Why do we have to change this? So current policies might favor the status quo. Then there is the complexity of teaching and learning. When I'm teaching at a normal university with 500 students, how can I help them to develop these evidence-based skills if I'm lecturing? It's quite difficult to do that. This, I think, is less of a problem here, but in other universities in non-developed or developing countries, even if you want to do research, perhaps you don't have access to all that data. Perhaps you don't have access to the journals. and thus you can't really collect the right evidence for your work. And in particular, I work a lot in Southern Africa. They basically have lack of access to full articles. So even if we know that a particular treatment for transplant patients is good, if doctors can't access these articles, they're still using old-fashioned evidence to treat their patients. Another real difficulty with this evidence-based practice is the inability of us as professionals to make sense of the data. When I read certain journals, it's like it's so complex and so difficultly written, I can spend an hour to read it, but a doctor or a teacher probably doesn't have the time to do that. And at the same time, there are lots of studies who have poor quality. So you're reading that and you're like, well, yeah, that's just an anecdote of one student. It could be amazing, but the quality of some studies may not be very good. And I think this is also a quite difficult challenge, is in my field, there are hundreds of opinions about, for example, the ethics of data. And some people fundamentally believe that it's fine to use data, others think it's a crime, others think it's fine if you have consent from your students. So who do you believe when you read all those articles and you quickly want to make a verdict? Then you have studies, for example, in problem-based learning that have not been conducted in Hong Kong. So how do you know that a system that works well in Europe, maybe it doesn't work in Hong Kong? What about the language of the publication? Most journal articles are in English. But if you're working in a Cantonese context or a South African context, and you want to read about something really important, if it's not in English, it's quite difficult to get access to that data. So there are lots of potential problems to this. But nonetheless, I think this is the way forward. And this is what I do in my daily practice. So I have a little bit of time, but I can also leave this to next time. So next time I will give 4 practical applications of how I use evidence-based practice in my own practice. And I probably will come up with more. So what I would like to do now is basically give you the opportunity to critique, comment, question, anything you want to basically, well, ask me anything while I'm here. So is there anyone who wants to ask a question?